Hannibal must be considered the ancient master of the military of the unorthodox. In attacking the Romans on their own soil, he never intended to take Rome itself. That would have been impossible. Its walls were high, its people fierce and united in their hatred of him, and his forces were small. Rather, Hannibal's goal was to wreak havoc on the Italian peninsula and to undermine Rome's alliances with neighboring city-states. Weakened at home, Rome would have to leave Carthage alone and put a stop to its imperial expansion. To know this kind of chaos with the tiny army he had been able to bring over the Alps, Hannibal had to make his every action unexpected. A psychologist before his time, he understood that an enemy that is caught by surprise loses its discipline and sense of security. When chaos strikes those who are particularly rigid and orderly to begin with, such as the people and armies of Rome, it has double the destructive power. And surprise can never be mechanical, repetitive, or routine. That would be a contradiction in terms. Surprise takes constant adaptation, creativity, and mischievous pleasure in playing the trickster. So Hannibal always took the route that Rome least expected him to take. The road through the Alps, for example, considered impassable to an army and therefore unguarded. Eventually, inevitably, the Romans caught on and began to expect him to take the least obvious route. At that point, it was the obvious that was unexpected, as at Alephi. In battle, Hannibal would fix the enemy's attention on a frontal assault, the ordinary, usual way armies fought at the time. Then unleash the extraordinary in the form of elephants, or a reserve force hidden to the enemy's rear. In his raids in the Roman countryside, he deliberately protected Fabius's property, creating the impression that the two men were in collusion, and ultimately forcing the embarrassed leader to take action, an unorthodox use of politics and extra-military means in war. At Alephi, Hannibal had bundles of kindling tied to the horns of oxen, then lit them and sent the terrified bellowing animals up the slopes to the pass at night, creating an indecipherable image to the Roman sentries, literally in the dark, and a terrifying one. At Cannae, where the Romans were by this time expecting the unorthodox, Hannibal disguised his stratagem in broad daylight, lining up his army like any other army of the period. The Roman force was already impelled by the violence of the moment and the desire for revenge. He let them make quick progress through his deliberately weak center, where they became crowded together. Then the swift-moving outer wings of his line closed in and choked them. On and on he went, each one of Hannibal's ingeniously unorthodox maneuvers flowering out of the other in a constant alternation between the uncanny and the banal, the hidden and the obvious. Adapting Hannibal's method to your own daily battles will bring you untold power. Using your knowledge of your enemy's psychology and way of thinking, you must calculate your opening moves to be what they least expect. The line of least expectation is the line of least resistance. People cannot defend themselves against what they cannot foresee. With less resistance in your path, the progress you make will inflate their impression of your power. Hannibal's small army seemed to the Romans much larger than it really was. Once they come to expect some extraordinary maneuver on the part, establish a reputation for the unconventional, and you set your opponents on their heels. Knowing to anticipate the unexpected is not the same thing as knowing what the unexpected will be. Before long, your opponents will give way to your reputation alone. 2. In 1962, Sonny Liston became the heavyweight boxing champion of the world by defeating Floyd Patterson. Shortly afterward, he turned up to watch a young hotshot on the scene, Cassius Clay, take on and beat rather decisively the veteran Archie Moore. After the fight, Liston paid a visit to Clay's dressing room. He put his arm around the boy's shoulder. At 20, Clay was 10 years Liston and told him, "Take care, kid. I'm going to need you, but I'm going to have to beat you like I'm your dad.
Yeah,
Liston was the biggest, baddest fighter in the world.
Yeah.
To those who understood the sport,
It's like every time I get on one thing,
but Liston recognized
something on
Clay
the other
as
side,
a
and I
boxer
was
just crazy enough to want to fight him down the road.
Yeah, just set the timing.
It was best to instill a touch of fear in him now.
It's like, I had to try to break that
Fear
one
did
good.
not take.
It was way over on the other side.
As
So it's
Liston had
like,
guessed he would, Clay soon began to clamor for
That
a
was
fight with the champion
5 minutes.
and to brag to one and
So I'll do
all
5
that he
minutes.
could beat him in 8 rounds.
Oops.
On television and radio shows, he taunted the older boxer. Maybe it was Liston who was afraid to take on Cassius Clay. Liston tried to ignore the upstart. If they ever make the fight, he said, I'll be locked up for murder. He considered Clay too pretty, even effeminate, to be a heavyweight champion. Time passed, and Clay's antics provoked a desire for the fight in the public. Most people wanted to see Liston beat the daylights out of Clay and shut him up. Late in 1963, the two men met to sign on for a championship fight in Miami Beach the following February. Afterward, Clay told reporters, I'm not afraid of Liston. He's an old man. I'll give him talking lessons and boxing lessons. What he needs most is falling down lessons. As the fight grew closer, Clay's rhetoric became still more insulting and shrill.
Go back and forth.
Of the sports writers polled on the upcoming fight, most of them predicted that Clay would not be able to walk on his own after it was over. Some worried that he would be permanently injured. I guess it's quite hard to tell Clay not to fight this monster now, said the boxer Rocky Marciano. But I'm sure he'll be more receptive after he's been there with Liston. What worried the experts most of all was Cassius Clay's unusual fighting style. He was not the typical heavyweight bruiser. He would dance in place with his hands down at his side. He rarely put his full body into his punches, instead hitting just from the arms. His head was constantly moving, as if he wanted to keep his pretty face unscathed. He was reluctant to go inside, to brawl and pummel the body, the usual way to wear down a heavy. Instead, Clay preferred to dance and shuffle, as if his fights were ballet, not boxing. He was too small to be a heavyweight, lacked the requisite killer instinct. The press critique ran on. At the weigh-in on the morning of the bout, everyone was waiting for Clay's usual pre-fight antics. He exceeded their expectations. When Liston got off the scales, Clay began to shout at him, Hey, sucker, you're a chump. You've been tricked, chump. You are too ugly. I'm going to whoop you so bad. Clay jumped and screamed, his whole body shaking, his eyes popping, his voice quivering. He seemed possessed. Was he afraid or downright crazy? For Liston, this was quite simply the last straw. He wanted to kill Clay and shut the challenger up for good. As they stood in the ring before the opening bell, Liston tried to stare down Clay as he had stared down others, giving him the evil eye. But unlike other boxers, Clay stared back, bobbing up and down in place. He repeated, Now I've got you, chump. The fight began, and Liston charged forward at his prey, throwing a long left jab on him up. He kept coming, a look of intense anger on his face. But Clay shuffled back from each punch, even taunting Liston at one point by lowering his hands. He seemed able to anticipate Liston's every move, and he returned Liston's stare. Even after the round ended, both men were in their corners. His eyes never left his opponents. The second round was more of the same, except that Liston, instead of looking murderous, began to look frustrated. The pace was far faster than in any of his earlier fights, and Clay's head kept bobbing and orbiting in disturbing patterns. Liston would move in to strike his chin, only to miss, or find Clay hitting Liston's chin instead, with a lightning jab that made him wobble on his feet. At the end of the third round, a flurry of punches came out of nowhere, causing a deep gash under Liston's left eye. Now Clay was the aggressor, and Liston was fighting to survive. In the sixth round, he began taking punches from all angles, opening more wounds, and making Liston look weak and sad. When the bell for the seventh round rang, the mighty Liston just sat on his stool and stared. He refused to get up. The fight was over. The boxing world was stunned.
It's time to go again.
Or,
Oh no, I didn't start it.
since
That's
Liston
why.
had seemed to
Okay,
fight
now we're
as
gonna
if under
start.
some spell,
Round
his
3.
punches missing, his movements tired and listless,
So I'm gonna try.
had he just had an off night.
Ish.
The world would have to wait some 15 months
50
to
to
find out
75%
until the two boxers
I'm
rematch
gonna
in
try
Lewiston,
hard
May,
with technique.
May
I'm not gonna
1925.
miss a beat.
Consumed with a hunger for revenge, Liston trained like a demon for this second fight. In the opening round, he went on the attack, but he seemed wetter. He followed Clay, or rather Muhammad Ali as he was now known, around the ring, trying to reach him with jabs. One of these jabs finally grazed Ali's face as he stepped back, but in a move so fast that few in the audience even saw it. Ali countered with a hard right that sent Liston to the canvas. He lay there for a while, then staggered to his feet, but too late. He had been down for more than 10 seconds, and the referee called the fight. Many in the crowd yelled fix, claiming that no punch had landed. Liston knew otherwise. It may not have been the most powerful blow, but it caught him completely by surprise before he could tense his muscles and prepare himself. Coming from nowhere, it floored him. Liston would continue to fight for another 5 years, but he was never the same man again. Interpretation. Even as a child, Muhammad Ali got perverse pleasure out of being different. He liked the attention it got him. But most of all, he just liked being himself, odd and independent. When he began to train as a boxer at the age of 12, he was already refusing to fight in the usual way, flouting the rules. A boxer usually keeps his gloves up toward his head and upper body, ready to parry a blow. Ali liked to keep his hands low, apparently inviting attack. But he had discovered early on that he was quicker than other boxers, and the best way to make his speed work for him was to lure the opponent's chin just close enough for Ali to snap a jab at him that would cause a lot more pain for being so close and so quick. As Ali developed, he also made it harder for the other boxer to reach him by working on his legs, even more than on the power of his punch. Instead of retreating the way most fighters did, 1 foot at a time, Ali kept on his toes, shuffling back and dancing in perpetual motion to his own peculiar rhythm. More than any other boxer, he was a moving target. Unable to land a punch, the other boxer would grow frustrated. And the more frustrated he was, the more he would reach for Ali, opening up his guard and exposing himself to the jab from nowhere that might knock him out. Ali's style ran counter to conventional boxing wisdom in almost every way, yet its unorthodoxy was exactly what made it so difficult to go back. Ali's unconventional tactics in the first Liston fight began well before the bout. His irritating antics and public taunts, a form of dirty warfare, were designed to infuriate the champion, cloud his mind, fill him with a murderous hatred that would make him come close enough for Ali.
I couldn't make it down. I was like, oh, he's waiting to get her out.
The grip is not a good idea in the
Genuinely
first place.
Yeah, I wasn't really on
Later
there.
revealed his pure performance. Its effect was to make Liston
Oh,
unconsciously
shifted around.
defensive, unsure of what this man would do in the ring.
Yeah.
In the opening round, as in so many of his subsequent fights, Ali lulled Liston by fighting defensively, an ordinary tactic when facing a boxer like Liston. That drew Liston in closer and closer. And now the extraordinary move, the sweet punch out of nowhere, had doubled force. Unable to reach Ali with his punches, disconcerted by the dancing, the lowering of the hands, the irritating taunting, Liston made mistake after mistake, and Ali feasted on his opponent's mistakes. Understand, as children and young adults, we are taught to conform to certain codes of behavior and ways of doing things. We learn that being different comes with a social price. But there is a greater price to pay for slavishly conforming. We lose the power that comes from our individuality, from a way of doing things that is authentically our own. We fight like everyone else, which makes us predictable and conventional. The way to be truly unorthodox is to imitate no one, to fight and operate according to your own rhythms, adapting strategies to your idiosyncrasies. not the other way around. Refusing to follow common patterns will make it hard for people to guess what you'll do next. You are truly an individual. Your unorthodox approach may infuriate and upset, but emotional people.
I think that's the timer. Yeah.
But emotional people are vulnerable people over whom you can easily exert power. If your peculiarity is authentic enough, it will bring you attention and respect, the kind the crowd always has for the unconventional and extraordinary. 3. Late in 1862, during the American Civil War, General Ulysses S. Grant made several efforts to take the Confederate fortress at Vicksburg. The fortress was at a critical point in the Mississippi River, the lifeline of the South. If Grant's Union Army took Vicksburg, it would gain control of the river, cutting the South in half. Victory here could be the turning point of the war. Yet by January 1863, the fortress's commander, General James Pemberton, felt confident he had weathered the storm. Grant had tried to take the fort from several angles to the north, and had failed. It seemed that he had exhausted all possibilities and would give up the effort. The fortress was located at the top of a 200-foot escarpment on the riverbank, where any boat that tried to pass was exposed to its heavy artillery. To its west lay the river and the cliffs.
Yeah, you want to?
To the north, where Grant was encamped, it was protected by virtually
I was
impassable
just
swamp.
thinking we have to do like
Not far east lay the town of
a
Jackson,
sexy dance.
a railroad hub where supplies and reinforcements could easily be brought in. And Jackson was firmly in Southern hands, giving the Confederacy control of the entire corridor, north and south on the river's eastern bank. Vicksburg seemed secure from all directions, and the failure of Grant's attack
Two
only
more
made
rounds.
Pemberton more comfortable.
At least.
What more could the Northern general do? Besides, he was in political hot water among President Abraham Lincoln's enemies, who saw his Vicksburg campaign as a monumental waste of money and manpower. The newspapers were portraying Grant as an incompetent drunk. The pressure was tremendous for him to give it up and retreat back to Memphis to the north. Grant, however, was a stubborn man. As the winter dragged on, he tried every kind of maneuver, with nothing working. Until, on the moonless night of April 16th, Confederate scouts reported a Union flotilla of transport ships and gunboats, lights off, trying to make a run past the batteries at
Not cheating,
Vicksburg.
you're not trying.
The cannons roared, but somehow the ships got past them with minimal damage. The next few weeks saw several more runs down the river. At the same time, Union forces on the western side of the river were reported heading south. Now it was clear. Grant would use the transport ships he had sneaked past Vicksburg to cross the Mississippi some 30 miles downriver. Then he would march on the fortress from the south. Pemberton called for reinforcements, but in truth he was not overly concerned. Even if Grant got thousands of men across the river, what could he do once there? If he moved north toward Vicksburg, the Confederacy could send armies from Jackson and point south to take him from the flank and rear. Defeat in this corridor would be a disaster, but Grant would have no line of
So I was
retreat.
pushing the pace.
He
this
had
time.
committed himself to a foolhardy venture.
You push the pace.
Pemberton waited patiently for his next move.
Next time, I'll push the pace.
Grant
We'll do
did
2
cross
more
the river
hours.
south of Vicksburg,
And probably.
and in a few days his army was moving northeast, heading for the rail line from Vicksburg to Jackson. This was his most audacious move so far. If he were successful, he would cut Vicksburg off from its lifeline. But Grant's army, no different from any other, needed lines of communication and supply. These lines would have to connect to a base on the eastern side of the river, which Grant had indeed established at the town of Grand Gulf. All Pemberton had to do was send forces south from Vicksburg to destroy or even just threaten Grand Gulf, endangering Grant's supply lines. He would be forced to retreat south or risk being cut off.
Drag back.
It was a game of chess that Pemberton could not lose. And so, as the Northern general maneuvered his armies with speed toward the rail line between Jackson and Vicksburg, Pemberton moved on Grand Gulf.
Okay, don't let me stand up.
To Pemberton's
That was
utter
it. When
dismay,
I stood up, I was like,
Grant
"Oh,
ignored him.
okay." So don't let me stand up.
Indeed, so far from dealing with the threat to his rear, he pushed straight on to Jackson,
If you
taking it on May 14th.
by a technique, yeah.
Instead of relying on supply lines to feed his army, he plundered the area's rich farmlands. More, he moved so swiftly and changed direction so fluidly, Pemberton could not tell which part of his army was the front, rear, or flank. Rather than struggle to defend lines of communication or supply, Grant kept none. No one had ever seen an army behave in such a manner, breaking every rule in the military playbook. A few days later, with Jackson under his control, Grant wheeled his troops toward Vicksburg. Pemberton rushed his men back from Grand Gulf to block the Union general, but it was too late. Beaten at the Battle of Champion Hill, he was forced back into the fortress, where his army was quickly besieged by the Union forces. On July 4th, Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg, a blow the South would never recover from. Interpretation. We humans are conventional by nature. Once anyone succeeds at something with a specific strategy or method, it is quickly adopted by others and becomes hardened into principle, often to everyone's detriment when it is applied indiscriminately. This habit is a particular problem in war. For war is such risky business, the generals are often tempted to take the road well traveled. When so much is necessarily unsafe, what has proven safe in the past has amplified appeal. And thus for centuries, the rules have been that an army must have lines of communication and supply, and in battle must assume a formation with flanks and a front. Napoleon loosened these principles, but their hold on military thinkers remained so strong that during the American Civil War, some 40 years after Napoleon's death, officers like Pemberton could not imagine an army behaving according to any other plan. It took great courage for Grant to disobey this convention and cut himself loose from any base, living instead off the rich lands of the Mississippi Basin. It took great courage for him to move his army without forming a front. Even his own generals, including William Tecumseh Sherman, thought he had lost his mind. This strategy was hidden from Pemberton's view, because Grant kept up ordinary appearances by establishing a base at Grand Gulf and forming front and rear to march toward the rail line. By the time Pemberton had grasped the extraordinary nature of Grant's free-flowing attack, he had been taken by surprise, and the game was over. To our eyes, Grant's strategy might seem obvious, but it was completely outside Pemberton's experience. To follow convention, to give inordinate weight to what has worked in the past, is a natural tendency. We often ignore some simple yet unconventional idea that in every sense would upset our opponents. It is a matter sometimes of cutting ourselves loose from the past and roaming freely. Going without a security blanket is dangerous and uncomfortable, but the power to startle people with the unexpected is more than worth the risk. This is particularly important when we are on the defensive or in a weakened state. Our natural tendency at such times is to be conservative, which only makes it easier for our enemies to anticipate our moves and crush us with their superior strength. We play into their hands. It is when the tide is against us that we must forget the books, the precedents, the conventional wisdom, and risk everything on the untried and unexpected. 4. The Ojibwe tribe of the North American plains contained a warrior society known as the Windigokan, no-flight contraries. Only the bravest men who had demonstrated bravery by their utter disregard for danger on the battlefield were admitted to the Windigokan. In fact, because they had no fear of death, they were considered no longer among the living. They slept and ate separately, were not held to the usual codes of behavior. As creatures who were alive, but among the dead, they spoke and acted contrarily. They called a young person an old man, and when one of them told the others to stand still, he meant charge forward. They were glum in times of prosperity, happy in the depths of winter. Although there was a clownish side to their behavior, the Wendigoken could inspire great fear. No one ever knew what they would do next. The Wendigoken were believed to be inhabited by terrifying spirits called thunderers, which appeared in the form of giant birds. That made them somehow inhuman. On the battlefield, they were disruptive and unpredictable, and in raiding parties, downright terrifying. In one such raid, witnessed by an outsider, they gathered first in front of the Ojibwe chief's lodge and yelled, "We are not going to war. We shall not kill the Sioux. We shall not scalp 4 of them and let the rest escape. We shall go in daytime." They left camp that night, wearing costumes of rags and scraps, their bodies plastered with mud and painted with splotches of weird color, their faces covered by frightening masks with giant beak-like noses. They made their way through the darkness, stumbling over themselves. It was hard to see through the masks, until they came upon a large Sioux war party. Although outnumbered, they did not flee, but danced into the enemy's center. The grotesqueness of their dance made them seem to be possessed by demons. Some of the Sioux backed away. Others drew close, curious and confused. The leader of the Wendigoken shouted, "Don't shoot!" The Ojibwe warriors then pulled out guns hidden under their rags, killed 4 Sioux, and scalped them. Then they danced away, the enemy too terrified by this apparition to pursue them. After such an action, the mere appearance of the Wendigoken was enough for the enemy to give them a wide berth and not risk any kind of encounter.
Whether you're getting mugged or it's war.
Interpretation.
So you want to push the pace.
What made the Wendigoken so frightening was the fact that, like the forces of nature from which they claimed to derive their powers, they could be destructive for no apparent reason. Their mounting of a raid was not governed by need or ordered by the chief. Their appearance bore no relation to anything known, as if they had rolled on the ground or in trays of paint. They might wander in the dark until they chanced on an enemy. Their dancing was like nothing anyone had seen or imagined. They might suddenly start to kill and scalp, then stop at an arbitrary number. In a tribal society governed by the strictest of codes, these were spirits of random destruction and irrationality. The use of the unconventional can startle and give you an advantage, but it does not often create a sense of terror. What will bring you ultimate power in this strategy is to follow the Wendigoken and adapt a kind of randomness that goes beyond rational processes, as if you were possessed by a spirit of nature. Do this all the time and you'll be locked up, but do it right, dropping hints of the irrational and random at the opportune moment. And those around you will always have to wonder what you'll do next. You will inspire a respect and fear that will give you great power. An ordinary appearance spiced by a touch of divine madness is more shocking and alarming than an out-and-out crazy person. Remember, your madness, like Hamlet's, must be strategic. Real madness is all too predictable.
Your brother's slowing down, you got it. So
in April 1917,
consciously,
New York's Society of Independent Artists prepared for its first exhibition. This was to be a grand showcase of modern art, the largest in the United States to date. The exhibition was open to any artist who would join the society, whose dues were minimal, and the response had been overwhelming, with over 1,200 artists contributing over 2,000 pieces. The Society's board of directors included collectors like Walter Ahrensberg and artists like Man Ray and the 29-year-old Marcel Duchamp, a Frenchman then living in New York. It was Duchamp, as head of the hanging committee, who decided to make the exhibition radically democratic. He hung the works in alphabetical order, beginning with a letter drawn from a hat. The system led to cubist still lifes being hung next to traditional landscapes, amateur photographs, and the occasional lewd work by someone apparently insane. Some of the organizers loved this plan, others were disgusted. Chapter 25. Occupy the moral high ground. The righteous strategy. In a political world, the cause you are fighting for must seem more just than the enemy's. Think of this as moral terrain that you and the other side are fighting over. By questioning your enemy's motives and making them appear evil, you can narrow their base of support and room to maneuver. Aim at the soft spots in their public image, exposing any hypocrisies on their part. Never assume that the justice of your cause is self-evident. Publicize and promote it. When you yourself come under moral attack from a clever enemy, do not whine or get angry. Fight fire with fire. If possible, position yourself as the underdog, the victim, the martyr. Learn to inflict guilt as a moral weapon.
All right. You ready?
A moral weapon. The moral offensive.
We'll go easy.
In 1513, a 37-year-old Giovanni de' Medici, son of the illustrious Florentine Lorenzo de' Medici, was elected pope and assumed the name Leo X. The church that Leo now led was in many ways the dominant political and economic power in Europe, and Leo, a lover of poetry, theater, and painting, like others in his family, wanted to make it also a great patron of the arts. Earlier popes had begun the building of the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, the preeminent seat of the Catholic Church, but had left the structure unfinished. Leo wanted to complete this mighty project, permanently associating it with his name, but he would need to raise a fair amount of capital to be able to pay for the best artists to work on it. And so in 1517, Leo launched a campaign to sell indulgences. Then, as now, it was Catholic practice for the faithful to confess their sins to their priest, who would enforce their contrition by assigning them a penance, a kind of worldly punishment. Today, this might simply be a prayer or a counting of the rosary. But penances were once more severe, including fasts and pilgrimages, or financial payments, known as indulgences. The nobility might pay an indulgence in the form of a saintly relic purchased for their church, a large expense that would translate into the promise of a reduced time spent in purgatory after death. Purgatory being a kind of halfway house for those not evil enough for hell, not good enough for heaven, so forced to wait. The lower classes might pay a smaller fee to buy forgiveness for their sins. Indulgences were a major source of church income. For this particular campaign, Leo unleashed a squadron of expert indulgence salesmen across Europe, and the money began to pour in. As his chief architect for the completion of St. Peter's, he appointed the great artist Raphael, who planned to make the building a splendid work of art, Leo's lasting legacy to the world. All was going well until in October 1517, news reached the Pope that a priest named Martin Luther, some tiresome German theologian, had tacked to the doors of the castle church in Wittenberg a tract called the 95 Theses. Like many important documents at the time, the tract was originally in Latin, but it had been translated into German, printed up, and passed out among the public. And within a few weeks, all Germany seemed to have read it. The 95 Theses was essentially an attack on the practice of selling indulgences. It was up to God, not the church, to forgive sinners, Luther reasoned, and such forgiveness could not be bought. The tract went on to say that the ultimate authority was Scripture. If the Pope could cite Scripture to refute Luther's arguments, the priest would gladly recant them. The Pope did not read Luther's writings. He preferred poetry to theological discussions. And a single German priest surely posed no threat to the use of indulgences to fund worthy projects, let alone to the church itself. But Luther seemed to be challenging the church's authority in a broad sense, and Leo knew that an unchecked heresy could become the center of a sect. Within recent centuries in Europe, the church had had to put down such dissident sects by the use of force. Better to silence Luther before it was too late. Leo began relatively gently, asking the respected Catholic theologian Sylvester Mazzolini, usually known as Prierius, to write an official response to Luther that he hoped would frighten the priest into submission. Prierius proclaims that the Pope was the highest authority in the Church, even higher than Scripture. In fact, that the Pope was infallible. He quoted various theological texts written over the centuries in support of this claim. He also attacked Luther personally, calling him a bastard, and questioning his motives. Perhaps the German priest was angling for a bishopric? Prierius concluded with the words, "Whoever says that the Church of Rome may not do what it is actually doing in the manner of indulgence."
Let's go, keep going. Let's go.
The warning was clear enough. Leo had much on his mind during these years, including turmoil in the Ottoman Empire and a plan to launch a new crusade. But Luther's response to Prierius got his attention right away. Luther wrote a text in which he mercilessly took apart Prierius' writings. The Church, he argued, had failed to answer his charges and base its arguments on Scripture. Unless its authority in granting indulgences and excommunicating heretics
Wrong way.
Oh, that's the time. Careful there, don't let me go too far with that. You got this?
Yeah.
And I'll stop, because I don't want to break it.
Yeah.
But it was there, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to break it. I'm training.
Usually I just tap whenever. Like
heretics was rooted in the Bible. It was not spiritual in nature, but worldly, political.
Yeah,
That
right
kind
at
of authority
36
could and should
minutes.
be
There will be a
challenged.
sweet-ass throw sequence.
Luther
Yeah, that's
published
what-
his text alongside Prierius,
That was good.
allowing readers to
I
compare
didn't
the
think
two
about it. It was just kind
and
of
come
like,
to their own
That's perfect,
conclusions. His direct quotation of Prierius, his audacious and mocking tone, and his use of recently developed printing technology to spread his message far and wide.
And you're gonna
All
finish
this was
strong.
quite shocking
Practicing
and new to church officials.
numbers.
They were dealing with a clever and dangerous man.
I'll just be kidding.
It was now clear to Leo that the war between the church and Luther
That's been sitting
was a
in
war
bones
to
for
the
years.
death.
Because we're going to wring it out of you like a
As the Pope
stone.
pondered how to get the German priest to Rome and try him as a heretic, Luther
You
accelerated
must
his
train him.
campaign,
You must train every
continuing to
day.
publish at an alarming rate, his tone even more vitriolic. In an open letter to the Christian nobility of the German nation, he claimed that Rome had used its spurious authority to bully and cow the German people for centuries, turning Germany's kingdoms into vassal states. The church, he said again, was a political power, not a spiritual one, and to prop up its worldly rule, it had resorted to lies, forged documents, whatever means necessary. In On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, he railed against the Pope's lavish lifestyle, the whoring among the church hierarchy, the blasphemous art Leo funded. The Pope had gone so far as to have staged an immoral and bawdy play by Machiavelli called Mandragola within the Vatican itself. Luther juxtaposed the righteous behavior advocated by the Church with the way its cardinals actually lived. It was the Pope and his entourage, Luther charged, who were the real heretics, not he. In fact, the Pope was the Antichrist. It seemed to Leo that Luther had responded to Prierius' threat by raising the temperature. Clearly, the threat had been weak. The Pope had been too lenient. It was time to show real force and end this war. So Leo wrote a papal bull threatening Luther with excommunication. He also sent church officials to Germany to negotiate the priest's arrest and imprisonment. These officials, however, came back with shocking news that altered everything. In the few short years since the publication of the 95 Theses, Martin Luther, an unknown German priest, had somehow become a sensation, a celebrity, a beloved figure throughout the country. Everywhere the Pope's officials went, they were heckled, even threatened with stoning. Shop windows in almost every German town contained paintings of Luther with a halo over his head. 9/10 of the Germans shout, "Long live Luther," one official reported to Leo. and the other 10th, death to Rome. Luther had somehow aroused the German public's latent resentment and hatred of the church, and his reputation was impeccable. He was a best-selling author, yet he refused the income from his writings, clearly practicing what he preached. The more the church attacked him, the more popular Luther became. To make a martyr of him now could spark a revolution. Nevertheless, in 1521, Leo ordered Luther to appear in the town of Worms before the imperial diet, a gathering of German princes, nobles, and clergy organized by the newly elected Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Leo hoped to get the Germans to do his dirty work, and Charles was amenable. A political creature worried by the anti-authoritarian sentiments that Luther had sparked, he wanted the dispute over. At the diet, he demanded that the priest recant his teachings. But Luther, as usual, refused, and in dramatic fashion, uttered the memorable line, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. God help me." The emperor had no choice. He condemned Luther as a heretic and ordered him to return to Wittenberg to await his fate. On the way home, however, Luther was kidnapped and taken to Warburg Castle. The kidnapping had actually been planned and executed by his many supporters among the aristocracy. He was safe. Living in the castle under an assumed name, he was able to ride out the storm. Leo died that year, and within months of his death, Luther's ideas and the reforms that he had advocated had spread throughout Germany like wildfire. By 1526, a Protestant party was officially recognized in different parts of Europe. This was the birth of the Reformation, and with it, the vast worldly power of the Catholic Church, at least as Leo had inherited it, was irrevocably broken. That obscure, pedantic Wittenberg priest had somehow won the war.
Keep going. Switch arms.
Interpretation.
Come on, break.
Luther's original intention in his 95 Theses was to discuss a point of theology, the relationship, or lack of it, between God's forgiveness and papal indulgences. But when he read Prierius's response to his argument, something changed in him. The Pope and his men had failed to find justification for indulgences in the Bible. There was much more they could not justify as well, such as the Pope's unlimited power to excommunicate. Luther came to believe that the Church needed drastic reform. Reformation, however, would require political power. If Luther simply railed at the Church's wickedness from the pulpit or among his fellow priests, he would get nowhere. The Pope and his men had attacked him personally, questioning his motives. Now Luther in turn would go on the offensive, fighting fire with fire. Luther's strategy was to make the war public, transforming his moral cause into a political one. He did this by exploiting previous centuries' advancements in printing technology. His tracts, written in vigorous, angry language that appealed to the masses, were widely disseminated. He chose points of attack that would particularly outrage the German people. The Pope's decadent lifestyle, funded through the sale of indulgences. The use of church power to meddle in German politics. On and on. Perhaps most devastating of all, Luther exposed the Church's hypocrisies. Through these various tactics, he was able to spark and stoke a moral anger that spread like fire, forever tainting the public's vision not just of the Pope, but of the Church itself. Luther knew that Leo would respond to him not with arguments based on the Bible, but with heavy-handed force, which he also knew would only make his cause shine all the brighter. And so, with incendiary language and arguments that questioned Leo's authority, he baited the Pope into rash counterattacks. Luther already led an exemplary life, but he took it further by refusing all income from his writings. This widely known move, in effect, made his goodness theatrical, a matter for public consumption. In a few short years, Luther gained so much support among the masses that the Pope could not fight him without provoking a revolution. By using morality so consciously and
There you
publicly,
go. Think about
he
it.
transformed it into a strategy for winning power.
Stretch me out. Roll belly
The
down.
Reformation was one of the greatest political victories in history.
All right.
Understand,
Arch
you
your back
cannot
on
win wars without public and political support, but people will balk at joining your side or cause
Relax.
unless
Think
it
about
seems
relax.
righteous
Think about
and
relax.
just. And as Luther realized, presenting your cause as just takes strategy and
Relax.
showmanship.
Relax. Unconscious.
First, it is wise to pick a fight with an enemy that you can portray as authoritarian, hypocritical, and power-hungry. Using all available media, you strike first with a moral offensive against the opponent's points of vulnerability. You make your language strong and appealing to the masses, and craft it, if you can, to give people the opportunity to express a hostility they already feel. You quote your enemy's own words back at them to make your attacks seem fair, almost disinterested. You create a moral taint that sticks to them like glue. Baiting them into a heavy-handed counterattack will win you even more public support. Instead of trumpeting your own goodness, which would make you seem smug and arrogant, you show it with the contrast between their unreasonable actions and your own crusading deeds. Aim at them the most withering charge of all. That they are after power, while you are motivated by something higher and selfless. Do not worry about the manipulations you will have to resort to if you are to win this moral battle. Making the public show that your cause is more just than the enemy's will amply distract people from the means you employ.
That's how you finish it.
By Carl
I forgot to
Schmitt.
set the timer. I just wanted you to do it.
There always are
One more
concrete
time.
human groupings
Finish the thing.
which fight other concrete
I don't
human
know how long that
groupings in
round
the
was.
name of justice, humanity,
All right,
order,
we're done.
or peace. When being reproached for immorality and cynicism, the spectator of political phenomena can always recognize in such reproaches a political weapon used in actual combat.